Hello everybody. Today we're taking a look at the Browning double auto shotgun. We will just push this shell in, and it's chambered. If we wanted to have a second shell, it would then push and snap right into place like that. The thing just shoots itself. Bang! Oh, it's not an auto 5. As we explained before, loading the gun is very easy. Just take one shell, push it in the side, take another shell, do the same motion. The double auto is a frequently misunderstood shotgun, not just in terms of how its action works, but sort of where it fits into history. Some people will recount the double auto as being like an improved or a modified version of the Auto 5, and while there are a very, very small number of similarities, really the shotgun is a complete departure from what the Auto 5 is. And today we're going to take a brief look through the history, but then a deep look at the mechanism and internals of the double auto, plus a look at how it shoots to try and better understand what exactly this thing is. Jumping right in, one of the more important things about the double auto story is that the Browning in its name is not John Browning. Of course, the double auto was designed by Val Browning, and it was really one of the first guns that he had designed from the ground up that then got into production. Now, for those that don't know, Val Browning was the son of John Browning and was probably the most successful of John Browning's sons, and much of Val Browning's career would really revolve around in making improvements to the designs that his father had already established. We'll talk more about some of those improvements here in a little bit, but just to step right through the history, Val Browning had envisioned a two-shot automatic shotgun that was quick to load, light, easy handling, and capable of coexisting with the Browning Auto 5 on the market at the same time. Of course, from the very beginning, the double auto was not meant to replace the Auto 5. It was meant to offer something different or to supplant what the Auto 5 or what could be perceived as the Auto 5's weaknesses. Of course, we've talked about the humpback receiver and we talked about the overall weight, but probably the easiest way to understand the double auto is to understand what the double in its name means, right? It's a two-shot automatic. Now, we've already previously taken a look at the AR-17. This was a gun that was of some inspiration to the AR-17. And the double auto represented the birth or the popularization, or, to the extent it's popular in the first place, but the popularization of the two-shot automatic concept. To avoid rehashing too many things we've already talked about before on the channel, the advantage to a two-shot automatic is that, to some extent, if it's designed right, you can get the recoil reduction or the smoothness of an automatic without having the weight or bulk or complexity of an automatic that's, got 5 shots, right? In the case of the Auto 5, right? You can avoid having all of that weight and mass and bulk out in the front of the gun because you really only have 2 rounds. In the case of the double auto, that's one in the chamber and one on the side elevator of the gun there. Now, of course, the natural question that then comes is, but then you've got at least some of the complexity of an autoloader involved. Why would you want an autoloader that only has 2 shots? And again, not to rehash things too deeply, but for much of the hunting that you'll do, of birds, and pretty much all of the sporting, like, clay bird shooting that you'll do with shotguns, 2 shots is really all that you need, or 2 shots is all that you're going to be able to easily take advantage of. And so Val Browning envisioned a shotgun that would have those 2 shots, but be as quick and convenient as possible to load. Now, this shotgun was first trialed, sort of prototyped on the market in the 1950s, and was available with a lot of different colors on the receiver, sort of to make it pop or stand out. The problem was then in the 50s, the shotgun buying market probably wasn't ready for light blue or pink receivers or anything like that. So the guns sold very horribly, and Val Browning had all of those colored guns brought back to the factory on orders to destroy them. A scant few number of those original colored receivers still exist, as they were sort of pilfered out of the facility by employees. And Art's Gun Shop has a great video sort of going through the history of the double auto if you're interested in more about that story. Ultimately, the double auto would be retooled, reimagined, and there would be sort of 3 guns underneath the double auto banner made available. The traditional double auto, which is a steel receiver, we have an example of that here. The double auto 12-vet, which I don't have an example of here today, and then the Browning double auto 20 weight. The 20 weight would be as light as possible. The difference between it and the 12-vet is about half a pound, and it's really just taken out of the wood and a couple of lightning cuts on the internal parts. The 12-vet and 20 weight used an aluminum alloy receiver, and the 12-vet would be available in some fun colors, just not as many fun colors as had originally been planned or originally been trialed with the double auto. Now, the double auto would remain in production for a surprisingly long time. Not a lot of people really appreciate that. It did stay in production for a lot longer. It wasn't one of these things, the AR-17, right, was in production for a year, maybe a year and a half. The double auto stayed in production for quite a long time, but was always fighting the uphill battle of automatics weren't particularly appealing to Europeans just at a conceptual level, and Americans that were interested in buying an automatic would balk at the fact that this was a more expensive gun than the Auto 5 with a lot less capacity. And regardless of how well the gun handles or balances or points, it's sort of a wet blanket to be in the market for buying a new shotgun, and you can buy a brand new Auto 5 or spend 10 to 15% more depending on the year that you're looking and get a gun that's got much less capacity. As a result, the double auto would sort of fade into obscurity and Browning would eventually stop the production. But a decent number of the guns were made, and they can be found on the used market these days for generally less than an Auto 5, which just really reflects the difference in popularity, right? Auto 5s are still very desirable in America, and the used price for a double auto really reflects sort of the demand for this sort of a thing in general. However, I think the double auto is a really nice shotgun, and we'll go ahead and tear into its mechanism and then look at how it shoots, and then hopefully be able to give you guys a decent impression of what the thing is actually like. Since we have two examples representing the extreme ends of sort of the weight spectrum of the double auto, I thought we'd go ahead and put them on the scale just to sort of show that to you guys. Starting off with the 20 weight, it is a really light shotgun. Weighing in at 6.5 pounds, that's pretty darn light. And of course that's with a recoil pad and with the Weaver choke comp system, though this is aluminum, it doesn't really add a ton of weight. The gun is very light, but despite its light weight, it still balances incredibly well because, as we'll see whenever we get into the mechanism, there isn't a traditional mag tube out here in the gun, and so especially whenever it's loaded, there isn't that sort of shift in balance or that increase in weight out front. However, with the steel receiver gun, we'll see that it comes in almost 8 pounds. The steel receiver double auto weighing in the territory of a light 12 Auto 5 really makes the steel receiver guns a lot less interesting and appealing to me. It's cool that they were made, but ultimately you're not saving any weight for your drop in capacity, and so the only theoretical advantage here would be the complexity savings or the balance savings, but I have to be honest with you, this doesn't balance very well, because as far as I can tell, the double auto was always intended to be an aluminum receiver gun, just because of how poorly the steel receiver gun balances. The steel receiver guns would sell pretty poorly, and as far as I'm aware, they're the rarest of the double auto variants. Now, with that discussion of the history aside, let's go over just a couple of the handling features of the double auto. Of course, we have a very typical Browning-style charging handle here. Pulling that back, the bolt will lock to the back whenever the gun isn't loaded. Loading the gun is facilitated through this port, and later we'll look at the particular things that makes the loading on this shotgun so incredibly cool. However, that loading cannot be done through the bottom, right? This window is blocked off. This is not a loading port or an ejection port, right? Ejection's there, loading's there. The bottom of the receiver doesn't actually need to be cut out in terms of a functional requirement. Really, the only thing going on down here is that this lip edge on this plunger can be pushed forward to release the bolt, just done by pushing on the lip. And then the elevator will come up, and then the bolt can come back forwards. Otherwise, our only real control or functional item is the safety back here on the trigger guard. It's functionally ambidextrous because it's just this little knob on the back of the trigger guard, can be pushed down to prevent the trigger from being pulled and pushed up to allow the trigger to be pulled. Now, I had mentioned earlier that a lot of Val Browning's career really revolved around making improvements for existing Browning designs. One of the better examples of this is the Browning Superpose. Of course, John Browning had designed the Browning Superpose much earlier in his career, but it just didn't have enough interest and wasn't deemed worth pursuing further until there at the tail end of his life. Now, Val Browning saw getting the gun into production, but at that time it was still a two-trigger, right? The Superpose is a two-barrel shotgun, right, over-under, and initially in its design it had two triggers. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to the two-trigger system, but the big disadvantage is remembering which trigger does which barrel whenever you're in the heat of, swinging the gun around and shooting at a target or a bird or something. What Val Browning's biggest contribution to the Superpose was the single selective trigger system, which is very familiar to over-under shooters these days, where you can take the safety onto safe and then flip it left or right and then put it back onto fire, and that selects which barrel the single trigger is going to fire. After the trigger has fired that barrel, releasing the trigger and pulling it again will fire the other barrel. This doesn't seem like a terribly complex thing whenever you're describing it, but mechanically it's a very difficult thing to pull off properly. Getting this implemented on the Superpose was one of Val Browning's early accomplishments. Probably his other most notable accomplishment was the Browning speed load system. One of the most famous patents associated with Val Browning is that of the Browning speed load system. And while Val Browning had that patented in the double auto first, you may be most familiar with it from the Auto 5. In this condition, we have an Auto 5 with the bolt locked back and the gun is otherwise unloaded, and all we have to do is place one round into the magazine without any extra bolt presses or any extra manipulation, and it will automatically chamber that round. Val Browning figured out this system for the Auto 5, and it became standard on these guns come 1953-1954 timeframe. Val Browning's question, though, was if you made an automatic shotgun that was so quick and so easy to load that you could do away with having to have all this extra magazine space, wouldn't that become sort of the ultimate thing? And I think the double auto sort of gives that idea a lot of legitimacy. Of course, in the AR-17, it's so awkward and clunky to load that the whole two-shot thing really loses a lot of glamour. It's slow enough that if you are out hunting, you're certainly going to be holding up the line. And even for skeet shooting, right, you're going to be sitting there fumbling with loading the gun while everybody's sitting there rolling their eyes like, oh, great. Somebody brought an AR-17, going to spend all day loading it. Meanwhile, the double auto is incredibly quick and incredibly easy to load. We'll go over that and show you guys that in the sort of manual of arms discussion of the thing a little bit later. Now, I do want to plant a seed at this point where a lot of you may be thinking, much like I originally thought, that Val Browning must have been some kind of a genius, because this is a whole lot of very interesting shotgun mechanism to come up with really out of nowhere, kind of as his first thing, his first whole shotgun that he had designed on his own. It's pretty impressive. Well, as we'll see whenever we get to the disassembly of this gun, he had stolen a little bit of homework from a Czech guy who stole a little bit of homework from an Italian guy, but more on that later. This particular 20 weight is fairly customized. You'll see it's got a Weaver interchangeable choke system out there and a recoil pad that I put on there to give it a little bit more length of pull to make it comfortable for me to shoot. And you'll note the vent rib barrel. There are a lot of barrel options available for these. Sort of the rarest ones are the slug barrels. You'll see barrels that have a groove within the rib, of course regular ribbed barrels just like this, as well as barrels with no rib whatsoever. One of the things that was touted as being new or revolutionary with the double auto was the fact that the barrel could be changed very easily. Simply by pulling the bolt back, removing this latch underneath the barrel, and then pulling the handguard all the way down to the disassembly position, the barrel can just come straight out of the gun like that. It was touted that in under 30 seconds or in under a minute you could switch barrels, which is really cool, and then you're sort of left wondering, why does that matter? Like, are you going to be in the duck blind and be like, well, those ones are further away, watch this, and switch out barrels? I think that was kind of a marketing gimmick at the end of the day. Maybe what they were trying to get at is that with Auto 5s, right, in the era of fixed chokes, so assuming you weren't sort of ritzy enough to have an interchangeable choke system and you were stuck there with the fixed chokes of the day, if you had an Auto 5, in order to change barrels out, you have to unscrew that handguard cap and then take the handguard off and then take the barrel off and then put the barrel on. You get grease on you because of the friction system and then put the handguard back on. It's a little bit of work, and certainly if you're there in a duck blind, maybe that wouldn't be so fantastic, as this is a lot easier to deal with. You don't have to really undo anything, right? There's no screws. It's just a pull tab and then barrel comes in, barrel goes out. But really, that's the first step in disassembly of this gun. Probably the only things worth noting here is that we've got rails on a barrel extension, fairly Auto 5 inspired there. There's some cases in this gun where things were completely reinvented, but the barrel extension and how it mates up with the barrel is very, very Auto 5. There wasn't wheel reinvention going on there. The other thing to note is this lug here on the bottom of the barrel. Instead of that hoop on the Auto 5 that really connects it to the rest of the gun, we have this lug here. And once we get the handguard off, we'll be able to see exactly what that lug is doing. With the power of a punch and a hammer, we'll be able to knock out this pin. There we go, and that pin comes right out. And at this point, the handguard can be removed. We see inside of this handguard, it's got steel reinforcement in the rear, right? Certainly lessons learned from the Auto 5. Steel reinforcement there helps a lot. And steel reinforcement is not needed at the front of the handguard because the handguard isn't what holds the barrel on the gun. We see here that it's actually this sort of steel bracket that holds the barrel on the gun. And in fact, we can now rig this barrel back up just to sort of show you guys how that sits on there. So this is how that barrel assembly sits on the gun regularly. Whenever the barrel is completely locked into place, it's actually this metal reinforcement there on the forend that will push this block up, which will hold the barrel on the gun from coming off. And then whenever you remove the handguard, this block can drop down and lets the barrel in and out. That's more or less how your barrel's retained on the gun, but it's this steel block here that holds it on it, so you're not having, the barrel's not trying to beat its way forward against the wood like on an Auto 5. So certainly kudos to Browning for the improvements here. It's a very resilient handguard, and despite the fact that there's no magazine tube underneath it, it's still very chunky, very Auto 5. It's about an Auto 5 width, despite not having a full magazine tube underneath there. So it's interesting. They could have slimmed this out more, but I do still appreciate how girthy it is. Right? It feels regular and usual at that point, but there's that assembly. So now we get to talk about the action of this gun. This is one of the most frequently, I think, misunderstood or misattributed things about it. So people want to call this a short recoil action, and I agree up to a point that this is a short recoil operated firearm. Of course, we're familiar with the Auto 5, right, where the barrel and bolt are locked up and come all the way to the back, then the barrel comes forward, then the bolt chases it home after the barrels come all the way back to the front. This system is certainly not long recoil, however, it's not quite short recoil either. Whenever we talk about a short recoil firearm, we talk about the barrel and the bolt being locked together and traveling a short distance, usually it's a short fixed distance, before the barrel and the bolt unlock. That distance that it travels is usually less than the overall length of the cartridge itself. However, we can sort of see by the location of this rib relative to where the barrel sits in the receiver that that's an awfully long gap. Why would they leave such a long gap? Well, the reason for it is actually because the recoil system, the action on the double auto, doesn't quite have a fixed stop like we're used to seeing on like something like the AR-17, right? The barrel can move 1/8 of an inch. On something like a 1911, the barrel moves just long enough for it to swing down, right? On this, the barrel hooked into this hanger up front can reciprocate a really long distance, up to about 2 inches, which makes it kind of tricky to describe as just a regular short recoil gun. Maybe it falls into a family or like a relative branch of short recoil shotguns, but it kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth to call this short recoil because it's not quite. Of course, we have a friction ring system, pretty similar actually to the Magnum Auto 5s, where we have 2 friction rings. We've got a bevel on this band the barrel pulls on, a bevel there facing this way, a bevel there facing this way, and then just a flat ring supporting this here. We have an extremely stiff barrel spring, and effectively the way that this action works is whenever the bolt is forward, of course, the gun fires and things get driven backwards together. However, there's a lot of deceleration going on in the barrel, not just from the friction rings, but from this very stiff spring. Eventually, the barrel will be stopped, but not from anything bottoming out, right? It's not going to be the spring that bottoms out. It's not going to be the friction rings. Nothing runs out of travel here. And it's not the bolt and barrel striking the back of the receiver either. It's just somewhere between here and the rearward travel of the bolt. The barrel will have slowed down to just about nothing, and it will detach from the bolt while the bolt continues on backwards and locks to the rear as the barrel comes forward, and then another round is fed if another round is available. Otherwise, the bolt stays locked to the back. And just to help highlight sort of why I feel that way, if we take a shell, right, and chamber it up where the barrel is, we'll note that shell's kind of shy of the rib. Even if we take that shell and put it where the barrel sits in the receiver, I don't know if we can call that short recoil. And of course, maybe with the shell folded out, you can say that's the difference, but a live round of ammunition sat even forward of the chamber, right? This is how much travel you're going to have. You have the full length of travel available to you of this shell. And of course, the location of the rib doesn't really demark the full length of travel, but I've sat there with weighted bags and the gun in a vise pushing on the barrel. And you can get this thing to the point where that rib is almost touching on the front of that receiver. You'll be able to see that while this is certainly a very beefy spring, there's a lot of gaps in there, and if you measure up the gaps that the spring has to collapse into, you end up finding about 3 inches of total travel that this spring has, which is strange because this is a 2 3/4 inch shell when it's unfolded. So you'd have more travel in the system even than you have more travel allowed by the rib. Of course, the overall length of the action is going to be what stops it. However, what you then realize is it's operating as a long recoil shotgun at that point, right? This comes back its full length of travel. The rib is almost bottomed out on the receiver. This spring isn't quite bottomed out yet, and the bolt has stopped. And then the barrel can unlock and go forward. What do we call this? We call this a long recoil operated shotgun. So I don't know if what we need to classify this as is like a medium recoil operated shotgun or something like that, but just calling it short recoil doesn't quite sit right with me. Now, moving on, disassembly of the recoil system can be done by taking this aluminum nut and just rotating it off. At that point, you get your friction rings, you get your spring to come off. It's a little bit tricky to get those back on because that spring is so stiff, so we're just going to leave it where it is now. We can take this latch, of course this is the latch that holds the barrel on. We can set it to the side for now because otherwise it will just fall off of the receiver, and it's not something you want to lose. Now at this point, we will go ahead and get the bolt out of the gun. It's quite an involved process and really not very user-friendly. Frankly, in my opinion, it's even harder to do than with the Auto 5. And while I understand and appreciate that what Browning was trying to do here is have a receiver which is screwless, because that does look really good, they ended up making it pretty screwed up, but in order to get the screws out of the receiver. Finally, once we have the gun all the way taken apart, we'll put it back together, and then I will show you guys how the feeding mechanism on the gun works. But before we get into that, we have to remove our butt plate in order to get the stock off the gun, because the stock needs to come off, and instead of it being like the Auto 5 where we have a tang screw that we take off and the stock comes, it's done the less pleasant way where we have to get the butt pad off and then get a screwdriver up the butt end of the stock and then undo a screw and then pull the stock off. To get the screws out of the butt plate, we'll just take a little screwdriver we will grease the tip of the screwdriver up just a little bit to minimize the sort of rubber that it pulls with it. You just stick your screwdriver down in there, find the slot on the screw, and then take it off. With the butt pad taken off, we're now ready to stick a screwdriver up the butt end of the stock, loosen the stock off, and then remove it. We'll take a screwdriver that we've ground a square profile into so it doesn't bugger up the screw, and then remove the stock with it. Now, with that standard weight gun I had mentioned, it's basically brand new. Its stock really didn't want to come off. In fact, every piece of it fit together like it had been hand fit. It was all just so tight, but this 20 weight has been shot a lot. It's certainly a lot more clapped out, and everything just sort of comes apart with light hand pressure. I ended up having to make like a foam jig to hold the stock on the other gun in order to get it off. It was on there really, really tight. And it's not like it was rusted or corroded up or anything like that. It was just darn tight. With the action strip to this point, we can go ahead and let the bolt forward. Of course, don't let it slam, especially on the aluminum receiver guns, because you can crack receivers that way. I've seen people report that they've got receivers that cracked due to firing with the aluminum receiver guns as well, but it doesn't seem to be a very common issue, and I'm not sure if maybe they've got some combination of worn out springs or things assembled incorrectly that are causing those receivers to break, but it's certainly not as endemic as you see with other aluminum receiver guns like the Savage 745. Those will crack, and they will crack pretty predictably, and they'll crack just from regular use. I don't think that that's quite nearly as endemic a problem with these. Anyway, moving on with our disassembly, we will get ourselves a flat blade screwdriver. And now what we have to get to are a pair of little square pegs. We have a pair of square pegs. If we can get our camera to focus just right. There's one peg located right here on the side and one peg located right here. You may be able to see right there at the tip of my finger that square notch. There's one peg there, and they're really tricky to find and get out. Certainly, I struggled for a really long time to figure out how to take this thing apart. And it wasn't until studying a parts diagram I said, well, why are there two square pins? Well, it's because there's two square pins that hold the gun together, and getting them out involves prying them out with a little screwdriver. And again, on the standard weight gun, which basically has no wear on it, these pins were comically tight to get out. On this gun, it's certainly been taken apart before I got my hands on it, and the pins come out pretty easy. There's one pin there. And I tried to set the pins, right and left to remember which side of the gun they came out of. So we'll put right over there and then left over there, just in case the pins are, particularly hand fit or something. But I have this screwdriver that I ground a shape into to make it easy to do this, because of course, right in the middle of the way that you're prying, you have the spring there for the hammer that you have to be dealing with the whole time as well. There we go. That one's almost out. Not quite ready to come with finger pressure. Though at this point, maybe we can just get a skinnier screwdriver there on it. There we go. Maybe just lever against our thumb here. And with enough prying and wiggling, and then a little bit of help from a pair of needle nose pliers, even a sticky one can get out of there. So we'll set that one on the left because it's extra tight. And with that process done, the trigger group will just sort of lift up out of the bottom of the gun. And again, on guns that have not been taken apart much, this can be very, very stiff as well. Because really what's holding your trigger group into your gun after those pins are these square lugs, one there, on the sides of the trigger group, that sit down into those square recesses down there in the receiver. Now at this point, we're almost ready to go ahead and get the bolt group out of the gun. One last thing that I want to talk about here while we're looking at it is, in order to get the action spring out of these, it has a great big aluminum screw. I had made a wrench for this that I just wanted to show. I sort of milled a slot into the side of this to leave that bar there so that you could get in this slot. Because this slot is aluminum, and because on a lot of these guns, right, it goes into a steel tube, it will rust together or corrode together such that it's very, very tight, and any sort of flat blade screwdriver you try sticking in that slot isn't going to come out. So I just wanted to show you guys, right, you can make a tool like this pretty easy. I made it with a mill, but you could probably make it with a Dremel tool if you were desperate enough just to be able to take that cap off of there without damaging that screw head very badly, because if you boogered that up, you're probably going to have to drill it out, and that's no fun. However, in order to just get the bolt group out of the gun, you don't have to do anything with the action spring. The action spring plug actually has a little bit of a spring-loaded latch that grabs onto the rear end of the action bar there on the bolt group. And in order to get the bolt group then freed from that action plug, it's sort of a weird combination movement of lifting up here and then pushing forward on the bolt group to try and get it to come free. Sort of like like that. And then once you've got the action bar unlatched from here, you want to get the action tail to sort of stick down, which can be tricky to wrangle. See if I can get it here with a screwdriver. Probably just going to be impossible for you guys to see this, but that's what we want, is this action bar to dangle down like that. Because once we've got the action bar dangling down, we can slip the charging handle off of the bolt and then pass the bolt forwards. And we'll get ourselves a rag since this bolt is oily. And like so, we now have our bolt recovered from the action. Certainly Auto 5 inspired, I'd say, especially with how the whole swinging cam arm system for locking works, but it's not exactly like how the Auto 5 did it. We have a much stiffer, beefier action arm system. That action arm gets retained, like clipped by the plug, which is very interesting. And everything here is just scaled down a little bit more diminutive compared to the Auto 5 itself. The Auto 5 is certainly overbuilt in many different regards, and you have a little bit more of a petite, in terms of dimensions, breech bolt going on here. In order to disassemble the breech bolt, you have this toggle here. This toggle is really responsible for, when it's in its forward position, keeping the lock from rising so it doesn't try and lock prematurely. And then, of course, whenever it comes forward and hits into the breech, that toggle will get pushed backwards, and that lets the lock rise and fall as it needs to. Now, removing this toggle is something that a lot of people struggle with because it's completely unintuitive. I've seen a lot of people just take a punch and start hammering on there until they're blue in the face, which of course will never get it, because it's actually a compliant mechanism. I hate compliant mechanisms in guns, pieces of steel that you have to bend to get around other pieces of steel, but that's really what you're dealing with here. You have to lift up on this piece of steel there. You sort of have a slot. You can stick a screwdriver or a similar tool there in, and you pry up on that and then push backwards on the lock. So the way that I usually do this is a punch and hammer. I sort of hold, I hold everything sort of as an assembly. You push down on the screwdriver, you hold the punch, and then you hit backwards with a hammer. So you got to be doing several things at once that make it very difficult to show to a camera. But hold everything like so. And you can punch that toggle off, and there you have it. And you can see what holds the toggle on there is that round peg, and you can see the track there in the breech bolt that it sits in, and that's what keeps you from, that's what lets it slide back and forth, but it has to be lifted up out of it in order to get out of the gun. Now, with that toggle set to the side, we can go and remove the firing pin. The firing pin is extremely petite, and it has a 1911 style retainer plate. So we'll push the firing pin in and then lift the plate up, and you will want to keep the breech bolt pointed downwards as you do this, because that firing pin is desperate to just come screaming out of there. But we'll lift the plate up and then let our firing pin pop out. We'll see our firing pin spring, very long, our firing pin itself, comically diminutive. Leave those two together for now. And at this point we have our breech bolt assembly, and we can remove the lock by lining up a pinhole here and getting ourselves our small punch and just tapping it out. This punches out a pin on the other side of the gun, which lets the link come off of the lock. The lock comes out the top, and we can see, certainly Auto 5 inspired, but different than how the Auto 5 does it. In fact, in some ways similar to the Remington 1148, actually. But that pretty much strips our breech bolt there besides the extractor, and the extractor is just a vertical pin. You can drive it in and out as you need to. Otherwise, that's really all there is to it. It's pretty simple. All right, and at this point, we're ready to put everything back together. Assembly on this gun really doesn't have any particular tricks. I guess really the biggest trick is this goes in one way and not the other. It's curved downwards relative to the breech bolt, so it would be inserted like this. Otherwise, the gun is fairly intuitive to put back together because everything just goes in the reverse order that it came apart in. There's that. Get our firing pin. And it's always fun compressing this firing pin with its great big spring because of how anxious it is to go flying. So we will get the plate. I guess the plate, of course, has an orientation. The notch goes towards the side facing me. Like that. Get ourselves a bigger punch. To carefully push the firing pin down. Have to make sure that it can find the breech face hole there in the front. Get a punch to retain it. Just push it down until the plate can catch it. And at that point, you can manipulate the tip of the firing pin to get it lined up and retain the plate. That all looks good. At this point, we can take the toggle. Toggle just slides back on. Of course, the one arm of the toggle sits in there to help retain the plate. Like so. And then at this point, no more prying is required. You can just tap it on. Make sure that it moves. It won't move quite freely. It'll be pretty stiff, but it should be capable of moving back and forth. And at this point, you know that your breech bolt is put back together correctly. We will take our charging handle, get it ready. As we slide the breech bolt in, make sure the tail stays down. Charging handle slides in, and then the tail can kick up to retain the charging handle, like so. Now what we have to do is get the shuttle there for the action spring rotated correctly so it can relatch with the carrier tail. Usually this goes pretty easily, but in our case we'll just push that down, lift the carrier tail up just slightly. It's almost got it. And there we go. Locked back together. Now we can rack the bolt a couple of times just to make sure it feels good, and it does. Looking at the trigger group here, I guess I sort of skipped over that real quick. We've got a very familiar dog and elevator system here. The over-center mechanism on this is kind of interesting because it's very, it's very tendent to want to go up. In fact, maybe even just under gravity on this one, it will want to spring up. It's very interested in springing up. And as we'll see whenever we go to load the thing, we'll sort of see why it's important for this to be sprung so heavily upwards. It's very biased to its upwards position in terms of over-center mechanisms, where like the other shotguns we looked at, like the Auto 5, right? It wants to stay in one position or the other until it gets kicked out of there. This one just wants to be up pretty much all of the time. The fire control group itself is relatively simple. However, it's certainly packed in there. We've got dual driving springs there on the hammer. You can see the two springs. Whenever the hammer gets pushed back for reset, there's actually nothing to catch it. This is because it's actually the bolt coming back that will trip the disconnect. So, the hammer will get pushed back. The bolt will hit this hump right here, which will accomplish disconnect. It's sort of a slip sear that releases the primary sear. And then the trigger, getting pulled forward, resets the hump that the bolt hits and re-engages the trigger with the primary sear. So we can see trigger pulls, primary sear. The primary sear is that guy right there. The primary sear is sprung so it can rotate this way, so that whenever the trigger is pulled and the bolt hump is hit, the primary sear can come back to its original position to catch the hammer until the trigger is released and the system begins again. It's a relatively simple fire control group, all things considered. Having it so it's not quite an out of battery, but it's like the disconnect is actually accomplished by the bolt coming backwards is certainly very interesting. We don't see a lot of systems that do things that way, but it's certainly one way of doing it. There's nothing wrong with it. And I think what they were trying to accomplish here was to get rid of the trigger slap that exists in the Auto 5. It's not really noticeable just because it's a 12 gauge and it's got enough recoil that you don't quite notice that the Auto 5 does have a considerable amount of trigger slap because of how its disconnect works. Meanwhile, the disconnect here, the hammer doesn't touch the trigger at all, right? The hammer comes all the way back. It's not touching the trigger. It doesn't touch the trigger, it doesn't touch the sear until the bolt has come backwards. And then all that does is it latches the sear onto the hammer without touching the trigger. So it's cool the way that they've set this up as an isolator system. And the safety is very simple. Right? They touted this as being the greatest safety ever because it's ambidextrous. It sits on the back of the trigger guard and can be moved up and down. In the downward position, it just blocks the trigger from being pulled. The upwards position, the trigger is able to be pulled. Pretty simple, not a lot to write home about there. But that's our trigger group. We will slot it back onto the bottom of the gun here. And again, this can be really tight on some guns. And you will be fighting the carrier wanting to spring up the whole time. We will give it some light taps just to get it seated. You'll want to feel with your finger to make sure it's pretty much smooth and flush at the seams where the trigger guard meets the receiver. Once it is, you'll be ready to stick your pins back in. Very important when you're sticking these pins in. It's not quite possible to put them in backwards, right? It's very, very stiff to put them in backwards, but you want to make it so that the notch is facing towards the inside of the receiver. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult to pry them back out of there. I don't even like it. If you hammered one of these home in the wrong orientation, I have no idea how you'd ever get the gun back apart. You'd really screw yourself up good. But we will pass these pins back into those square recesses, which is really tricky to do on the camera. So I'll just get one of them started here. There we go. So that pin just sort of, you feel your way forward. There's a square slot in the trigger group and then in the receiver that this pin holds things together with. We'll get one pin started, but I recommend that you start both of them before you send either of them all the way home, just because they can bind up a little bit. We'll go ahead and get this one started like so. Get it pushed forward. Yep, just like this one was stiff coming out, it's stiff going back in. So we will get our hammer and then tap these back into place with a punch. Like so. We now have our trigger group reinstalled and are ready to remount the stock. Doing that is pretty easy, just the use of a screwdriver. Go ahead and tap that stock on. And we'll go ahead and do up the screws here and for the butt plate just real quick. And finally, with the stock remounted, we can lock the bolt back, get our barrel latch. The U-shape faces downwards, but it just slides back down into position like that. Make sure that it doesn't fall out as we wrangle everything else. We'll take the handguard, get it slotted on, just like that. And then we're going to line up this pinhole with one of the pinholes in that aluminum dug there on the end of the recoil assembly. And then very carefully, you'll punch this through. If you punch that pin through crooked, you can knock these steel escutcheons out of the wood. You don't want to do that because then you've got to JB weld them or acro glass them or whatever back in. So try and avoid boogering that up as best you can. And the easiest way to do that is just by tapping this pin lightly. The pin will sort of sit below flush on either side. Once you get it to that point, it'll be good. There's a ball detent that retains it, so it's not going to fall out on its own. At this point, lower the handguard all the way to the lowest position. Take our barrel, slot it in. And it's important to be careful as you do this because it is very, very easy to ding up the wood as you're doing this. But slide the barrel on like so, push the handguard up, and the handguard should click firmly into place. And at this point, everything is back as to how it should be. Now, I promised I'd show you guys the feeding mechanism, sort of show you why it's important for the elevator to be biased upwards. The reason for that is because with the bolt in the backwards position, right, the bolt isn't going to be slapping the dog and then giving the carrier the extra flick that it needs. With the bolt in the backwards position, loading the gun involves, on the side loading port here, we're just going to push a shell forwards. Pushing that shell forwards is going to release this latch, this spring-loaded plunger here. Once that latch is released, the carrier is able to pop up without the bolt smacking it, right? It needs to be able to pop up on its own. Once it pops up, the dog will release the bolt, and then the bolt will chamber the round just like that. In Browning speed load fashion, we will just push this shell in. If we wanted to have a second shell, it would then push and snap right into place like that. And then on cycling, the gun would fire, eject, and eject. Of course, we'll be able to see a lot more of this during the shooting segment of this video, but just to show you guys one more time, but looking at this side of the gun, we push the shell in, and it jumps right into the chamber. A very, very interesting mechanism, and it does load really, really quickly. Especially if you're right-handed. This isn't the most lefty-friendly gun, at least in terms of loading quickly, but if you're right-handed, you can keep your firing grip at all times, and all loading is done in the same motion, and it's all done with your support hand, whereby all that you're really doing is taking a shell and doing that. You go 1, 2, and the gun's loaded. If you're just topping off, it's just 1. It's a very easy, very quick to use system because of that. Now, as a lefty, it's still the same motions, it's just that you're doing it with your firing hand. So you're delayed slightly in terms of getting the gun up into your shoulder because you're going 1, 2, and then a new firing grip, and then ready to go again. Meanwhile, as a right-handed shooter, I'm pretty confident that you could take the gun, without taking the gun out of your shoulder, you could just go 1, 2 and load it because it's that easy. This is easier than loading a speed load auto 5. It's easier than loading really any shotgun mechanism ever. It's maybe even easier than plunking rounds into the chamber just because this is so loose. You have plenty of wiggle room there, and all that you have to do is push it forwards. And this can be with your finger or your thumb or the heel of your hand. And there's really no risk of it biting you either, right? Because you have such a generous cutout there on the carrier. You could have your finger like partway in here and it's still going to be able to feed, and you won't be at risk of getting a finger smashed. That is really, really cool. Now, during the shooting segment, we'll have to do some drills or something to sort of highlight this, where I'll have maybe 2 rounds in the gun, but need to shoot 3 targets, and so I'll go bang, bang, and then really quick load 1, and then bang 1 more time. Something like that, just to show you guys, it's a really, really slick system that they pulled off here. The advertising, I think, said something to the effect of, it's a 2-shot automatic that's never truly empty because it loads so fast. And once you get the thing in your hands and you get familiar with the loading cycle, that's a lot more true than it is marketing nonsense. It's a fast-loading, fast-handling gun. And I like that a lot about it. However, one last thing we need to talk about before we get to the loading section. You can look at the system on this gun and go, wow, that's genius. Val Browning had all of this stuff figured out, man. He was really on top of things. The one problem being, the feeding mechanism of this gun isn't entirely unique to the double auto. The way it's arranged here is unique, and the way it facilitates speed loading is unique. But this is not the first time this mechanism shows up. In fact, the first time this mechanism appears is in the CZ241 shotgun. This is an auto 5, it's a long recoil gun, and it'll have its own video certainly coming before too long. However, as we'll see in this gun's video, it has the same plunger-style system to retain the carrier. It has a carrier that springs up in a similar way. This gun doesn't have the dog and carrier system. It's just got a carrier that's biased upwards for whenever the bolt comes backwards, so it's slightly different in that regard. But this plunger mechanism and the way it holds down the carrier is familiar to us. And the way that the round loaded on the carrier pushes the plunger forward and has the carrier biased upwards such that the bolt can come back forward is really what Browning's speed load is all about. And if we take the CZ241, push the loading door forward, put a round underneath the bolt, then push it forward and wiggle it just right, the action will take it. This isn't something the CZ241 is supposed to be capable of doing. You have to push the shell in there and sort of wiggle it around just right so that it pushes the plunger down and then pushes the elevator down, but then it'll take it right up into the chamber. Now, dollars to donuts, there's so much similarity in how this plunger works and how the recoil system underneath this barrel looks and how the carrier interacts with that plunger that I think Val Browning had seen a CZ241. Now, this story gets one step deeper because, as far as I have been able to research so far, the designer of the CZ241 more or less lifted the way this gun's feeding mechanism works from an even earlier Italian prototype. I haven't been able to track down the patent on this exactly. The Italian patent office for stuff prior to World War II is notoriously finicky to track stuff down with. However, I'm doing my best to see if I can figure out where Browning's speed load's DNA really becomes possible, because it's certainly here. And I'd like to know if it's possible there in that Italian shotgun, because at the very least, I don't think Val Browning is really due full credit for having invented it. I think the designers of the CZ241 probably, if not the Italians, are due maybe a little bit of credit in that regard, at least for how the carrier and the plunger interact with each other. Val's design and how it loads in the side is way quicker and way more efficient than what you've got going on with the Czech gun. However, it's not 100% unique and novel here. We see a little bit of that same mechanism going on in the CZ241. And to show you guys that one more time, we put the shell in the bottom of the gun and push it forward just at the right angle, and the gun will take it, just in a Browning speed load fashion. I haven't found anybody else saying that their CZ241 will do it, so maybe they haven't noticed it, or they don't have just the right angle that they have to push a shell in figured out. It seems to me that Val Browning probably saw this mechanism, he saw this gun and went, I could make that suck a lot less than it currently does. And that became the double auto. Anyway, we'll have a separate video on the CZ241 and talk a lot more about it and its particularly unique mechanism later. But for now, let's go ahead and go shoot the Browning double auto. Here we have the Browning double auto outside for a little bit of shooting. This thing is just so incredibly light. Of course, this is our 20 weight. It's an unbelievably light gun, a lot like the AR-17. The thing just barely weighs anything once it's in your hands. And today we're going to do a little bit of clay shooting with it. Now, of course, we're going to be shooting very easy targets. The primary reason for this is because it's very difficult to capture clay targets on camera in a way that makes it easy for you guys to see what's going on. So we have targets that are close and a very easy trajectory to track. Now that also makes it a little bit easier for me, but then that makes it much more embarrassing whenever I miss, which happens unfortunately often. We have a Weaver choke comp system on this gun. It reduces recoil a little bit. We have the 1/2 choke in this thing. Even though this choke measures out at almost what a full choke normally is, with this choke, the thing patterns like a skeet choke. So we have ourselves choked pretty darn well for the sort of targets we'll be shooting, right? An open choke for targets so close is a good pairing. But we'll just go ahead and do a little bit of shooting with the thing and then sort of tell you guys how it feels. As we explained before, loading the gun is very easy. Just take one shell, push it in the side, take another shell, do the same motion. The gun now has its full capacity of 2 shells in it. In a little bit, we'll do some drills just to show you how quickly you can actually load the gun whenever it's up in your shoulder, whenever you're doing something with it. In our case, shooting targets, but maybe if you were hunting, to show you that, like Browning's advertisements say, this gun's never quite really unloaded because it is just so fast to reload. Frankly, I think that you could keep up with some pump action shotguns with as quick as, if you just one-handed the gun and then had one hand you're just stuffing shells in, you could come close at least to keeping up with a pump action, at least if the pump action was forced to reload at some point. Like if it was a 10-shell drill and the pump action's a 5-shell gun, I think you'd be able to beat it pace-wise with this. It loads really, really fast, and it points naturally, and it doesn't hardly weigh anything. But all that yammering aside, let's see if we can't hit some stuff here. Well, 2 relatively easy shots there. Now, I do want to mention, this gun's recoil is nowhere near as smooth or soft as the Auto 5's. We've already sort of talked about its action, which is this quasi-short recoil, almost long recoil, medium recoil action, but because of how heavily it's sprung, it does sort of give you a rubberneck effect, at least with the lightweight guns. The steel gun doesn't do this as much for me, but the lightweight guns push you backwards and then pull the gun forwards in such a manner that it leaves your neck feeling almost like whiplash. It's not painful, it's not bad, and we are using 3-dram loads, which are kind of heavy for a gun like this. But this is the sort of thing where, kind of unlike the AR-17, I could not shoot this gun all day long. If I had to do 200 rounds in a day with this gun, and there were 3-dram loads, I would be feeling pretty miserable by the end of the day. Sort of while the AR-17 is like a punch, this thing is like a very hard push backwards and a very hard push forwards, like almost like the braking on a roller coaster is how I would describe it. Is that feeling in your neck, the sort of feeling. It's not comfortable, but we'll go ahead, get it loaded up, and have 2 more not comfortable shots from a gun that just shoots as nicely as this. I shot straight over the top of that one. All right, try it again. We have a little bit of wind today that's making some of these targets soar, up almost to the tree level, and then some of them are just diving down at the level of the wood pile. So it's making a little bit of variation here for me. That first one I shot over, if I'm being honest, I never saw the bird. I just sort of shot where I thought it would be, which wasn't where it was. But loading this thing is just so darn easy. 2 shells in the gun again. Here we go. The gun is really, really nice shooting. Right, that little bit of whiplash aside, that's the only thing I can complain about with this gun. It points naturally. Even though it's as light as it is, it swings so much better than the AR-17. And I think that's mostly just because it's a steel barrel, and the AR-17 with its aluminum barrel doesn't have any weight very far out on the gun. This thing just swings better, it points better, it handles quite a bit nicer. And of course, some of that may just be, right, this choke comp system that we've got out there on it is going to be softening recoil quite a bit. On the AR-17, you don't get any of that. So that's probably a big part of it, because these guns weigh about the same amount overall. But I would say that this thing is, again, it's smoother, certainly smoother, but just because of the way the recoil impulse feels, it leaves your neck just a little wiggled, which isn't fantastic, at least for me. It's entirely possible that somebody built or shaped differently wouldn't have that whiplash thing going on. I guess people who have double autos can respond in the comments. If you've got like a 20 weight or a 12 vet, does it do that to your neck too? This isn't engagement bait, I'm actually curious. I haven't talked to many other people who have these things, but the several of these I've shot, all of them left me going, that tweaks something in my neck. All right, so for our next test, we're going to do that quick reload drill. So I'm going to have 2 shells in the gun, but then I'm going to hold 1 extra shell in my firing hand between 2 fingers. And so what I'm going to do is shoot and then reload and then shoot again, just to show you guys how quickly this thing can be reloaded. It's almost scary fast. All right, so we got 2 rounds in the gun. Of course, this is much, much easier if you're a right-handed person. Me being left-handed, I'm going to pull the trigger with my middle finger and then have our extra shell here for quick reloading. But of course, if you were right-handed, you'd hold your extra shell in your support hand and it would be much more natural because that's how the gun's intended to be loaded. I wish they made a left-hand version of this gun so that I could be able to experience that without feeling awkward. But we'll go ahead, get wrapped up here, do 2 shots and then a reload and then another shot as quick as we can. And I mean, it's just that easy. It's really, really an interesting feeling, right? Just that quick, you put the shell in the gun and you don't even have to really be looking at the loading port. Assuming the nose of the round finds the loading port, just chunk, the thing goes right in and the gun's ready to fire. It's really, really fun. The next test I want to do with this thing is a look at actually how the action works. We'd mentioned before that depending on the weight of the shell, the barrel can reciprocate further back. And today we only have 2 3/4 and 3 dram loads. But even between those, you should be able to see a difference in how far back the barrel actually reciprocates before the barrel and bolt unlock. And of course, as we explained before, if this was a true short recoil system, the barrel would need to have a positive rearward stop that's less than the overall length of the shell. And the variation in the load and how long it takes the spring and friction system to actually stop the barrel is actually what sets how much travel there is. So with a theoretical extremely heavy load, this thing would be working practically like a long recoil gun, which is contrary to a lot of the information you'll find out there about it. Of course, at the time the gun was made, 2.5 dram loads, as far as 2 3/4 inch 12 gauge goes anyway, 2 dram and 2.5 dram loads were pretty much non-existent. 2 3/4 was sort of your light load by the time this gun was around, but those extra light loads were still around out there, and the gun would need to cycle with those. And when shooting loads that light, there's a very dramatic difference in the barrel will probably only cycle about 1 inch compared to those 3 dram, 3.5, 4 dram loads. The barrel's pretty much working like this thing's a long recoil gun. The barrel's coming all the way back to its end of travel, which is the full length of the shell, right? The barrel's over the loading port, and then the barrel goes forward and then the bolt goes forward. Well, that's about it for the double auto. We've seen how it works. We've got an idea for how it handles. Overall, I would say it's not as smooth as an Auto 5, but it does cycle faster than an Auto 5, and the gun is so light, it really is a very impressive thing. Now, if we're sitting here being the cork sniffers that we are, comparing this to the super lightweight, the aluminum receiver Auto 5 is probably the best comparison. And by the time you've made that comparison, in the interest of being completely fair, I think the super lightweight Auto 5 is a hands-down better gun. The lightness and trimness and shortness of the action that you get here is cool and all, but you can get an Auto 5 that weighs about a half pound more than the 12-vet, which is about 3/4, almost a full pound heavier than this. But that Auto 5 will have the capacity, it'll be smoother, it'll be a much more enjoyable shooting experience. And I think ultimately that's the lesson with the double auto's marketing and its performance and its sales. Sure, the super lightweight Auto 5 wasn't really available to the US, but even compared to a light 12, you're saving about 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds here. That is a lot of weight, but you're asking people to spend more money for that performance, and it's not gonna kick anywhere near as smooth. And it's not gonna have the capacity, and I think that turned a lot of people away from it. I don't really think that's fair. I do still think this is an incredible gun, right? Especially if you sort of set an arbitrary weight limit, like a 12 gauge automatic shouldn't weigh more than 6.5 pounds. That cuts out a lot of the market and sort of leaves this and the AR-17 and other weird things like it standing on their own. And for that reason, I think it's a really cool shotgun. I think if you're interested in one, if you're curious, like, is this a good gun? Yes, absolutely. Parts can still be found for them, even like new old stock parts are around. And that said, the guns don't hardly break parts. It's a really, really interesting gun, not just because of how it is in its place and how it fits in Browning's history and what with the Auto 5, but most people think this is just a regular short recoil gun where the barrel moves like 1/4 of an inch and then the bolt cycles. And because it's just got a really weird mechanism that really doesn't show up anywhere else, just for that reason, it's certainly worth keeping around. Let's go ahead here, put 2 more rounds through the thing, and then send you guys back to the table for any final thoughts. The thing just shoots itself. Bang!
Oh, it's not an auto 5.
Alright, we're back inside, and that's really been our look at the Browning double auto shotgun. In my opinion, the more interesting of the double autos are the aluminum receiver guns, so the 20 weight and the 12-aught are much more interesting than the steel gun. The steel gun's weight and its balance just sort of makes the whole proposition uninteresting to me. I think if you're going to have that sort of 2-round dedicated gun, it's more interesting in the style of these or the AR-17, where you're reducing the weight as much as possible because you're reducing the excess parts as much as possible just to give you those 2 rounds that ultimately most people are going to end up needing. These days, the double autos can be found relatively affordably used in varying conditions, but as we've discussed several times already, you can still find parts for them, so it's certainly a gun that you can take out and shoot without having to worry, right? At least in the case of the AR-17, they will break extractors eventually, and they can bend or break ejectors as well, and then you're sort of looking at making new parts from scratch to keep that running. Whereas the double auto existed for long enough and was manufactured by a relatively large company, and so you can find parts for the double auto still, and you can keep these guns running. So as far as enjoying the whole 2-shot automatic gimmick, I suppose, I think the Browning double auto is the best way to go about it. And again, specifically in the aluminum receiver guns. Not that the steel receiver guns are bad, I just think that they're heavy. I don't think they balance terribly well. And ultimately, you've got a gun that weighs as much as an Auto 5 that's only got the 2 shots, and that's just not as interesting to me. Though I am firmly of the opinion that the super lightweight, the aluminum receiver Auto 5s are still the better option if this was to be a debate between the aluminum receiver double autos versus the aluminum receiver Auto 5s. I think the Auto 5s are only slightly heavier, and they give you that smooth recoil impulse. And really, that's the only thing that I can knock this thing for is in the aluminum receiver guns especially, they just give me that little bit of whiplash effect in my neck. The recoil is just not as smooth, it's not as comfortable as you can get in a long recoil gun. And of course, part of that is you've got an action that is much shorter, right? In fact, this is supposedly like the shortest automatic 12 gauge action that exists, and I guess I don't doubt it because that is really, really short. But owing to that short action and owing to the way that the spring mechanism works, the gun cycles very quickly, which means it's not necessarily very smooth. So all things considered, I do like the Auto 5 better, but that's not to say that what's going on here is bad or uninteresting. When it comes to skeet guns, this particular one, just the way it fits me and the way it swings, the way it balances, does fantastic. My consistently best shooting skeet gun is this. As sort of funny as that is, it's a beat-up old 20 weight that I bought used. The thing just practically shoots itself when it comes to those targets. You have to swing and lead a lot. The thing is very, very natural feeling to do that. But all that aside, my closing thought is the double auto is a very interesting gun. I wish it would have become more popular. I wish there were more of them out there, but it's not rare in the same way the AR-17 is, right? You can go and buy one, you can find one used, and you can enjoy it. And they are certainly very enjoyable guns. In the wide variety of configurations you can find them in, with aftermarket chokes or not. It's a very, very cool gun, and it's certainly kind of an interesting, if not to collect, right? They're fun to buy just to shoot because they are absolutely 100% shootable guns. Just, if we're to sit here and sniff wine corks, it's not quite as smooth as an Auto 5. But don't let that distract you from the fact that it is still a very, very cool gun. I think I'll sort of leave you guys with that if you're interested in a double auto, hopefully this has maybe answered some questions about how they come apart and get put back together. They are a little bit of a bear to take apart, but by the time you've ground a screwdriver to pry out those square bars, it's really not that bad to take care of them. Really interesting guns otherwise, but if you guys like this sort of video, or you liked this video, or like videos about other things that aren't really like this, I've got a Patreon. You can check that out in the description and support me there. I guess more support ends up meaning more videos, and we do polls about which shotguns to talk about. This was one that had won a poll. People were interested in this one in particular, so you guys can sort of join in the polls there and influence me on which shotguns get talked about in which order. But this has been the Browning double auto. Closing thought, if I had to pick one word as a closing thought, it's going to be fast, because it cycles fast and it loads really fast. And that's good and bad. The loading fast is only good, but the cycling fast is good and bad. It's good because it's fast, but then it's bad because it's maybe not as smooth as an Auto 5. But I'll leave you guys with that. The Browning double auto, it's fast.